May your eating nourish you as much as what you hear from these folks. Amen.
I love that.
We are having an abundance of riches here, and we're going to turn to a panel with friends who are here from the media. People talk about the media a lot, but the media has many different arms and ways of getting to us. But represented here is a great group of people who you have heard and seen before, but who we've invited to talk to us about how this issue of public theology that we've been talking about plays in the media, and to think with us about what preachers need to be doing in order to help shape that narrative. So let me give you a quick introduction. I'll start to my left. If you've never seen Sarah before, you've probably heard her. Sarah McCammon from NPR. Please welcome her. Weeknights on MSNBC, Sister Joy Reid.
Hey.
From The Nation magazine, John Nichols. Thank you for being here. And from Roland Martin Unfiltered, Roland Martin. I want to start with you, Sarah. So we have a bookstore here this week, and if you go to the bookstore, you can find books by every one of these people, but you'll find Sarah's book, which is The Ex-Evangelicals, recently published. And thank you for sharing your story. And one of the things that you share about is your reporting over some time now about these folks who grew up in the church but are no longer affiliating with the tradition they grew up in. And I wanted to start by asking you to talk about just how you understand the relationship between this narrow set of so-called moral issues that has been very shaped by organizations that have encouraged religious people to focus on just a few things. Just to let you know, we screened here last night a new film called Bad Faith. And that film really points out, takes an hour and a half to tell the story of who shaped those issues. But talk to us about how that has impacted people who've grown up in these churches, including you, which you've written about too.
Yeah, well, growing up in a white evangelical church, being a Republican was synonymous for us with being a Christian. I didn't know that there was another world out there and other ways to see things. And the issues that were emphasized were the issues you're probably thinking of: abortion, gay rights, opposition to abortion rights and gay rights, and several other issues that you might call culture war issues. And I think the reason, I understand now as a journalist, the reason that those issues get emphasized and talked about as moral issues very often is because of the outsized influence of the white evangelical vote. So when I was growing up in the 90s, 1 in 4 Americans just about were white evangelicals. And we talk about white evangelicals specifically, of course, because voting patterns are so different depending on racial categories. That number is down to more like 14% today, but white evangelicals still vote in huge numbers. They still make up about 1 in 4 voters. And there's no other religious group, historically and even to a large extent today, that is so large and so united. If you look at like white Catholics, for example, they tilt a little bit toward the Republican Party today, but not nearly to the extent that white evangelicals do. And so that is why they've become such a dominant force in Republican politics, and why the issues that they identify as moral issues are prioritized. In my reporting, I've done reporting on efforts by the religious left, groups we all know, I think, to talk about other issues like poverty and racial justice, which are also in the Bible in one way or another, as and arguably in the Bible much more than some of these culture war issues, to talk about those as moral issues, as religious issues. And I think you can have a whole conversation about how much we want to talk about religion and politics in a pluralistic country with separation of church and state, but the reality is, in America, we talk about religion and politics together a lot. Religion seems to motivate a lot of our politics, and so I think there are a lot of fascinating conversations to be had around how religious views shape political views, and vice versa, frankly.
I'm going to step off the stage, but I want to put one question in the room. because we've been wrestling with it in this conversation. And how can you all help us understand how we can help the conversation get away from this left and right stuff? See, I'm offended when somebody calls me a left Christian because it ain't biblical. I'm offended if you call me a right Christian. That's language that has come from somewhere. And it's utilized to give equal moral standing for things that are not even equal. Most of the time, stuff that's called, I'm a conservative. So how do you measure me? I don't think the people that call themselves conservative are conservative in anything that's Christian. If your main hack is against gay people, I'm an evangelical. My church is white evangelical. Now, we don't call it that per se, but if evangelical means inviting people to believe in Christ and getting baptized and standing up for the poor, how have we gotten to this place that we allowed folk to tell us who they are, even though that's not who they are, and then we repeat their language? Because we end up writing off, like, you got a whole lot of white evangelicals in this room. But we ain't white evangelical like Christian nationalist white evangelical or black evangelical. All of our churches are evangelical. But where did this language come? Who came up with it? You know, who told the media and the people that run the media, when y'all report, this is how you report this?
Well, first of all, it's not even that. Media operates like sports teams. It has to be Celtics versus Lakers. It's left versus right. It's red or blue. Because, let's be clear, how executives, how hosts, how bookers, that's sort of how they want to frame everything. And so, okay, what side are you on? Well, what Reverend just said, no, I'm speaking to the issue. Yeah, but what box are you in? I'm not in a box. So they force you to be in a box because that's how they want to actually set it all up. And so if you have to understand how that structure is. I remember going on Megyn Kelly's show, they wanted me to take a position about Hillary Clinton and her emails. I'm like, I don't give a damn about the emails. And they were like, well, can you say this? I'm like, I don't care about her damn emails. And we're literally 30 seconds from going on the air. And it was like, okay, yeah, but we had this thing set up this way, and I'm going, and so that's the problem.
So we've got
it's the structure.
So we've got a room full of preachers here.
Yep.
And preachers share with journalists this task of storytelling and are familiar with this temptation, right, to simplify the framing so you can tell a story. Now, this is a good point you're making, right, because it gets pushed, in all of our worlds. But I want to talk for just a minute, while I'm still with you, Sarah, about the consequence that has, right? So that framing has been around for a while, and you've been talking to people who grew up in churches where that really impacted their spiritual lives. Can you share a little bit about just how that framing has impacted churches? Because we got pastors here who are pastoring people who've grown up in this framework.
Yeah, and I agree with Reverend Barber that the term evangelical is really squishy. It gets thrown around a lot. I mean, we have to have shorthands in journalism to talk about things, and so there's a lot of polling that uses those kinds of terms, and we tend to talk about, we tend to talk about data, so we have to use the words the data uses, the data takers use, I guess. But to answer your question, the ex-evangelicals that I've talked to, many of them have been on a journey that I think a lot of people who've grown up in a religious environment, regardless of their race or background, can relate to, which is sort of rethinking what parts of their faith they want to take into their adult lives and what parts they don't. And for a lot of people, those conversations, they're not just about Donald Trump, but they've been catalyzed by this moment where that term, evangelical, is so contested, and where, there are, since really 2016, there have been all of these really public conversations about what it means to be evangelical. And so the people I talk to, many of them, some of them I knew personally, and some are authors, others are podcasters, and some of just ordinary people I found in social media spaces who are really reflecting on what that label means or doesn't mean.
Joy?
If I could add that, I think what you all have to understand, and that, I think Roland has experienced, having worked
mic.
at CNN.
Your mic.
Oh, my mic is not? Oh, maybe my
blocked.
mic is loud. Hello? Okay. Can you hear me now?
Probably just pop on the lapel.
Okay.
We can hear you.
So what I think a lot of folks in this room should understand is that, and Roland experienced this, I'm sure, at CNN, and I experienced it working in cable news, is that Sarah is in the very small minority of people in the media who grew up in church. Most of the people who are on the other side of that wall, the people who are reporters and executives, they come from a secular space. And so they don't have a personal relationship to people who are in the church, because they're generally, and I'm not saying all of them, but you don't come across many people. I find myself often being the explainer of church people, even in my own team, because I grew up in the church. And so what I think of as evangelical and what they think of as evangelical are two different things. When I think of an evangelical, I think of Bishop Barber, because he is an evangelical, right? My family are evangelical, or some of them are Methodist, which is like kind of, I don't know if any of y'all are Methodist pastors, but that's like 1 hour church. As opposed to like Baptist, which is like 4 hour church. So I've been to both, because I have evangelicals in my family and I have 1 hour church.
But a black Methodist church might be
All right.
an hour 45.
It's 1 hour church and a football game and watch football after. That's what I grew up in.
Because I grew up black Catholic.
AME Zion in the house, all right.
Right. And then, but so the point being is that we have a politics that has been distorted by what the Public Religion Research Institute, which is to me the finest polling organization in the country, they've delineated these designations of white evangelicals, who again are about 14 to 15% of the population. And then if you think about it, what opposes them in the most powerful portion of the sort of election process, which is the primaries, where white evangelicals are disproportionately influential and disproportionately MAGA. On the other side of that, there's a disproportionate influence of black Christians, because they are concentrated in the Democratic Party. But you have this interesting thing of like 13% of the electorate, or 11, 12, 13% are black Christians, and about 13, 14% are white evangelicals. And they are in direct opposition to each other. So for the people who work in media, what they see is the impact of that disproportionate impact, meaning that black voters tend to push the Democratic Party toward issues that are important to black folks, and white evangelicals tend to push the Republican Party toward issues that are important to them. And so you then have sort of secular media people interpreting that and then viewing all evangelicals as what they see in the Democratic primaries. So I think that's part of the problem, and then in a sense not really understanding that much what black evangelicals. And then the last thing I'll say is, on top of that, you have a disproportionate influence of far-right Catholics on the Supreme Court. The majority of the people making the decisions for our lives on the court in that 6 Trump conservative majority are not evangelicals. They're actually Catholics. And they have their own far right-wing religious view that has a disproportionate impact that matches with what white evangelicals are learning is the right way to operate our society. So we have a country that's supposed to be secular, but that increasingly is being governed by a super minority group of outre, far-right Catholic and white evangelicals who self-identify that way. And so all of that's being interpreted by a media that doesn't get Christianity at all.
Can I say one thing real quick, Romero? But here's one thing, Joy, that I think also happens. We again say white and black, and we leave out all these white folk who are not using white evangelical, because in the white evangelical framework, white is the operative word.
Right.
Not evangelical.
That's right.
So we didn't miss my man right here, my man over here, my man over here, and then when they lose, we act like they won. Like the extremists lost in North Carolina, for instance, in 2014. They had a candidate in the governorship, they lost, the incumbent lost. But then the media acts like they're so powerful, like that the Grahams are so powerful. The Grahams lost North Carolina. They lost the governorship. They lost the attorney general, or they lose the presidency, right? And we're just struggling with, in this conference, how, and you're helping us, by the way, and Roland, thank you for what you said about, is that what I'm hearing part of is that folk really sometimes in media, except for folk like you all, don't even want to take the time to really learn who we are.
They're being simplistic.
That being too damn simplistic,
Yeah.
and they allow folk to come on and say, I'm a Christian, and it ain't got nothing to do
Right.
with nothing in here. And they say
they
it,
don't know.
but they don't know, and they won't ask.
Right.
They won't get a consultant. They won't say, I'm getting ready to have a conversation with such and such about Christ. So let me hire a couple of theologians to
Right.
consult my show.
Right.
But on the other hand, they do know this. They know that the stuff they are saying is Christian, like anti-abortion, anti-gay, pro-guns. Even if you don't know this book, you know it ain't right.
Right.
That's right.
You
But
know?
they don't know, but I
they-
think they start to take what this small group, this 14%
Right.
say, and they graft that onto what they think of as all Christians. And I will let, I'm the last thing I'm gonna say, because my brain is a sieve and I won't remember it if I don't say it like this moment, is that what I try to do, at least on our team, is to, I'm a little bit sensitive to the term conservative, because I agree with Bishop Barber that what people describe as conservative isn't what I grew up understanding as conservative. So I think what could help you all is you have to start to force the media to use correct terminology. Like white Christian nationalist is what I mean when I mean somebody who is a white Christian nationalist. I don't mean conservative. Don't let them mix those two terms up.
Thank
Or
you.
white
We're gonna
evangelical.
come to John because you have an important piece here. But let me just say, since you brought up the PRRI data, and since I know we have a lot of clergy here who pastor congregations that would be considered on that data mainline Protestant,
Yes.
that Robbie has found very clearly that while this extremism, let's not call it conservatism, let's call it extremism,
Yeah.
while this extremism that comes through churches is predominant in many evangelical spaces, that it's also pretty widespread in white mainline spaces. So it's important to talk about in those spaces too. That's what the data says. Now, you are unique in your willingness to highlight stories that are representing a different kind of faith. Talk to us about why and what you've experienced in trying to tell those stories.
Well, you have to know that Jonathan, who's lost control of this panel. Everybody's come from all sorts of different directions, all of them important.
Hold on, wait.
You gotta put your mic higher.
Let's get him on, or you can use this one.
Test?
There you go.
Okay, so Jonathan sort of lost control of this panel.
That's all right.
No, it's good, because everybody's got so much to say that we're saying it even before you ask. And then Reverend comes in and adds a whole bunch of more questions.
But there's a lot to say.
There is so much to say, and this is an important thing. Jonathan gave us some questions before we started out. He said, well, there's some things to help frame us a little bit, and you've gotten us pretty much.
I didn't read any of them.
I know you didn't.
Go ahead.
But I did, and I don't know that it helped me any. It actually ended up, but I wrestled with it because you were asking about this question of lifting up people who are in fact faithful and whose faith influences their political actions. Faith influences what they do. And I wrestled with that question because I realized that I am an absurd outlier. That I actually go into interviews with people, and I before I go in, I like to explore their faith. I want to know so I can ask them questions that get there, because I know that that's going to tell me a lot more about who they are and where they're going, right? And I won't go on a great length on this, but I will tell you that our craft, journalism, we are basically taught to be secularists, right? We are taught very early on that if that religion, you can cover it a little bit. Maybe there's a religion beat, right? We used to have those when we had newspapers. And there's a religion beat, but you shouldn't, you shouldn't let it get it too much in there, right? Shouldn't be, and you shouldn't bring it up with someone. Let them bring it up. And what I have found is that this has cheated us as a craft. It has made us bad at what we do because we don't ask the next question or the essential question. And I'll give you.
So what do you learn when you do?
Well, this is what you learn. So it happens I'm a Quaker, which means that I should be silent right now. But because I'm a bad Quaker, I'm sitting around talking. And so We're very generous and flexible. But
So was Bod Rushton.
hey, and he was a very good Quaker.
right.
Yeah, he was probably he's a winning Quaker. But so this is the deal. I'm interested in this question, and I'm interested in the people who are, dare I say, the ones that a lot of journalists look at as being, if you're thinking, I gotta hope I get my Bible right here, but the notion of being sort of in Acts, right? In Acts, where we're talking about people speaking, everybody hearing the same language, right?
Pentecost.
That's right. And then it's this weird thing because the devout men all say, well, they're drunk and they're drunk. They must be drunk on new wine. And of course, what we're told is no, they weren't drunk on new wine. They were bringing us something. They were someplace where we hadn't been. They know something. Well, when you ask someone about questions about faith, this is what you get to. You get to Barbara Lee. Barbara Lee, who was raised Catholic, and pretty serious about it. And she hardly ever gets asked about it, but that's who she is. So on 9/11, one of the most horrible days in the history of the country, people killed, all these horrible things happened. Barbara Lee is a member of Congress. Now, all of you know, because you're activists and engaged, that she cast the single vote against authorizing use of force to come out of that because she believed that there had to be other ways and better ways. Turns out she was right.
Yeah.
Now, but the question
A dissenter. We talked about dissenters earlier. We had
Yeah.
a single dissenter, yeah.
she was the dissenter. And I was interested in why. So I did one of the first interviews with her, and I said, Congresswoman, what was your day like that day? She said, well, I went to the National Cathedral initially for the prayer service. And then I said, well, what was this? Let's talk about the sermon. And she started talking about the sermon, and she said, the preacher said, let us not become the evil we seek to defeat. Mm-hmm. And she said, that I was infused with that. I went into Congress that afternoon. I had just been in the National Cathedral. I went to Congress, and they said, well, we're voting on whether to authorize the use of military force. And I said, I walked right up there, and I cast my vote no. And I assumed a whole bunch of other people would as well. It was only later that I realized I was the only one, right? And if you only knew that she cast that vote, you'd say, well, she must be a very anti-war person. She's former Ron Dellum's aide. There's all this other stuff like this. No, she had been at church that day. Mm-hmm. And if you put that into the storyline, right, suddenly you have a different storyline, right? This is a storyline that speaks maybe to a conservative, maybe to somebody who is not even in her same place, but they hear it because they go, wow, she went to church and she heard thou shalt not kill. My goodness, maybe I should be thinking that way too. So suddenly my story becomes a different story and a better, deeper story. Let me give you one other example, and then wiser, better people will say things. But I cover labor a lot because I actually think people work for a living, right, ought to be a beat. And Joy Reid, who's one of my great friends and heroes, has had me on her show more than once to talk about labor, right? It is my narrow zone of expertise. And so we have a new head of the United Auto Workers Union, Shawn Fain. And we all know about him, we've seen him, and he's a very dynamic figure, and he's all over TV. And so I wanted to go see him, and luckily enough, sometimes I get allowed in to interview people, so I go over to the Solidarity House in Detroit, and there's Shawn Fain. And I had, of course, read up on him before. And so I'm sitting down, we do all our conversations about organizing, how they're going to organize the South, which is the great challenge, as you know, Roland, the great challenge of organizing unions in the South, going down there where they've been beaten again and again and again. And I said, Shawn Fain, it seems to be working down there, right? You're actually, now they've got Volkswagen, they've got Mercedes organized, all these things going on. And he says, yeah, we've got a lot of strategies. I want to ask, do you think your religious faith may be a part of this in some way? And he says, oh, that's interesting, right? Because, of course, Shawn Fain is deeply religious. He prays every day. He prayed about whether he should run for the presidency of the UAW. And his prayer was so powerful with him that he said, I don't care if I win because I know I've sorted this out. I'm spiritually where I need to be. I'm running for this office. So I said, well, we started talking about the South. He said, well, the South is pretty religious. And there's a lot of, there's my phone call, and that's probably somebody right there. But so he said, South's pretty religious. You got white evangelicals. You got those black churches, right? They're often working in the same plant, right? And so when Shawn Fain goes down there, he doesn't just speak to them as a labor leader. He speaks to them as somebody who's read the Bible. Yeah. Now, and believe me, I'm not preferring any religion over another. I'm telling you that, you could read Torah, you could read Quran. My point is that he comes to them from a place that happens to be where a lot of them are.
No, this is a part of who people are.
So let me just finish this thought, though, because this is the thing. Just last week, he's down there, and they're announcing that they've broken through on Mercedes, one of the hardest plants to organize in the South. This is a huge, huge labor victory. It's being covered as a labor victory. So I'm looking back at the videos of Sean Fain, and he's talking to a multiracial group of workers, and he goes, if you have faith the size of a mustard seed, you can move a mountain. And I wasn't looking at him, I was looking at the crowd, and I was seeing white workers looking at black workers going,
I learned that in Sunday school.
I know that phrase.
I know that.
I know that phrase. And what I'm telling you is, I'm not saying he's a good man, bad man. That's not my point. My point is, my journalism is better because I know that when you mention faith the size of a mustard seed can move a mountain, that is going to connect with a whole bunch of people. And so my prayer for journalism, none of which have been answered up to this point, so it's the first time. But my prayer for journalism is that we might try, in this battered, difficult time for our craft, to go deeper on exploring faith. It doesn't mean, yes, to go deeper on exploring faith.
But we have to recognize that.
Oh, before I bring your brilliant thought in, let me just finish this one last.
Okay.
Because I know it's going to be so good that I'll be just, But let me just offer this one last prayer as regards why we go deeper. We don't go deeper simply to do you a favor, right? This is not to do a favor to people that are trying to raise real issues. It is actually the way that I think we get our country to a place where we might actually start to have conversations. Because if media forms the narrative of our country, as it does, and it keeps doing what you were talking, this thing of putting you in your camp and this dividing us up at every turn, if we're not talking about that we both understand what faith the size of a mustard seed means, then how are we ever going to get to have that deeper conversation about why we basically are human beings and we might actually all believe, when we cut away all this drama, that we might actually all believe in some things that we could find a place and a way to that higher ground.
Which means that we have to be willingness, though, to challenge people.
Yeah.
And I think part of the problem for folks who are not in the category of right-wing evangelicals is that most of the folks in that category are soft.
Yeah.
They don't want to fight. They don't want to do battle. I mean, today is April 9th. On this day, the great theologian, the German theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer was hung today.
Yeah.
This is also the birthday of Paul Robeson. And what you find is you find folk who do not want to do battle. And so you're going up against folks who've already framed the conversation. And so when I was on CNN for 6 years and Tony Perkins was on the other side, I relished when he was on it because it was like, Tony Perkins, Family Research Council, he's a pastor. And I'm like, Tony, if you want to go toe-to-toe on the word, let's go.
When we talk about aborting babies, so you're saying to me that because we support life, actually giving babies the opportunity to live, I'm confused.
Baby born.
I'm so confused.
No. First of all, hold up. You're confused because you think I'm saying something that I'm not.
Well, tell me what you're saying.
What I'm telling you, I'm being very clear. You cannot say you are pro-life when you vote against prenatal care for the mother. You cannot say you are pro-life when you vote against Head Start. Right. You cannot say you are pro-life when you do not want to expand Medicaid to keep hospitals open. You cannot say you are pro-life when you have OBGYNs who are not available in your state. Yeah. You cannot say you are pro-life when you have black women who are dying at a higher rate during childbirth and you do nothing public policy-wise to fix it. You cannot say you are pro-life if you allow infant mortality rates to be sky high in areas where there are black and brown people. What that tells me is you are anti-abortion. You are not pro-life. Right. Because if you are pro-life, you care about the child in the womb and when the child is out. And if you are pro-life, you are standing there with black folks when their kids are killed by cops. You are not silent. So if you are pro-life, be pro-life from the womb to the tomb, but not just in the womb.
That's good.
So I want you So let me explain. So let me break it down. So my deal is I'm going to take your argument and I'm going to then put it through a faith prism and then now force you to now actually answer the question, are you actually a person of faith? So when Joy mentioned the conservatives who are Catholics on the Supreme Court, every time I hear, again, I'm born and raised Catholic. The Catholic church I grew up in was found in my grandparents' living room. So when a Republican Catholic tells me that they are pro-life, I then say, oh, so you support the Vatican's position on abortion? They go, absolutely. I said, do you follow the precepts of the Catholic Church? Absolutely. I say, so what is your position on the death penalty?
That's right.
I said, because the Catholic Church is as against the death penalty as they are abortion.
That's okay.
Then all of a sudden, it's a deer in headlights. So part of the problem is when you're doing combat is understanding the language of the person you're dealing with. That clip right there has done, and it literally has gone viral every single month. So it's probably collectively now done about 30 million views. Somebody is going to drop it on TikTok and Facebook, and it's going to go crazy. And I get text messages or emails all the time. I'm like, y'all, that was a year ago. But the point there was,
That's good.
I wasn't going to have a pro-choice, pro-life conversation. I needed her to understand you cannot tell me that you're pro-life if you're voting against all of these other things. And so that's what I mean by challenging people. And so when we talk about, I totally understand what you're saying when you go deeper. But what happens is we want to make this thing this nice, flowery, but then once you now go to public policy, those same people are actually voting with their pocketbook and not their Bible.
That's right.
And so we have to be willing to challenge them on that. And so when Trump stands there with an upside Bible, and I hear these folks say they're voting for him, because there was a pastor of Wooten in North Carolina did a whole sermon, and I've already told my producer, I said, oh, please book his ass on my show. Just, y'all didn't understand, I'm a cussing Christian. The reason I said book him, because he gave a sermon, he said, no one can show me one law Trump signed that wasn't biblical. I said, book him. So a lot of folk are afraid to challenge them head on. And they're afraid because they're afraid of the heat that comes back. My deal is, I welcome all heat. And so in this space, you got to be willing to also challenge media. You've got to be able to say, Joe Scarborough, you got to be able to say, Caitlin College, you got to be able to say, why do y'all keep booking these preachers, but you don't book these preachers? You have to challenge them by saying, you keep putting these folks on, but why am I not seeing this person, and this person, and this person, and this person? Because how they do it, they will sit here and put all these folks on. And I'll give you this last one. I was at CNN. It was the day that Falwell and Robertson endorsed Giuliani in 2008. And we had this big meeting, and we were talking about data and whatever. And I said, and I'm talking about the president of the networks, they're all the show EPs. I said, hey, by the way, y'all booked me on black stuff since I'm the only one in this room who's a Christian author who's married to an ordained minister. Y'all can also book me on them endorsing Giuliani. And the whole room went quiet. They were like,
that's right.
The whole room was like, they were like, did he just go there? And I said, yeah, y'all can book me on non-black stuff too. I can talk Jesus.
That's right. That's right.
So in there, they had to get challenged. And unfortunately, a lot of us don't want to challenge the power structure to expand the dialogue.
So John says if folks in the media know faith, you can tell different stories. Roland says if you're in the media and you know faith, you can reframe the issues. Faith can help you do that. What other things would you offer for pastors who are concerned about this narrative and want to be engaged in reshaping it?
I would say it's important to understand how journalists do their work and how journalists figure out what a story is. And so, we could probably spend all day talking about journalism 101, but usually something's newsworthy, and the way to make news is to talk about something that's new that's timely, that affects people's lives, that intersects with an issue that's sort of in the public discourse. And so, those are the times that I tend to quote religious figures, is when they're saying something about something bigger that's going on, or if there's something happening in churches that is newsworthy. I mean, I think one of the biggest stories right now is the shift away from religiosity, which appears to be happening faster in white churches, but it's not limited to the white church. And so, if pastors out there are taking some action, retooling their strategy, their messaging in response to that, if that decline is having an impact, it's causing churches to close, whatever the case may be, find something new, find something that people care about. And I think building relationships with reporters or with organizations that have relationships with reporters, it's about really understanding kind of how we do our business and how we look for stories.
Okay, Joy?
Well, and I would add too, I just learned this about Shawn Fain from you just now, right? And so I would say, because we really don't get the same amount of volume from evangelicals who are not Christian nationalists. They're very loud. They're a very small group.
And organized.
They're very vocal and they're very organized.
And they have media teams.
And they have media teams that make sure I probably get 10 to 12 emails a day from that camp booking, not only requesting that I book somebody from that world, but having a whole list of what their talking points are already in the email. So they're pushing up, they're trying to get themselves booked on. I can't tell you the last time I've had a red letter Christian reach out to me other than my play pastor, Bishop Barber, who is the person who stays in my ear and says, hey, this is what we're doing. This is where we're moving. I do get emails from you too, my brother, but you keep emailing me to my other email. I'm about to correct your email to make sure you have the right one, because when I check that one, I get it from you. But I mean, you two are probably the few. So I think number one is being bigger advocates. But the other thing that you can do, because not all pastors are TV people necessarily or want to be booked, if you were the pastor of Shawn Fain, that is something that you could encourage him to be more vocal about, not just when he's talking to John, but when he's talking to me, right? So we are getting him booked. We get pitched him every so often. We'll get pitched a labor leader, for instance. But they don't come on prepared to talk about this in a faith context. They wouldn't think of it, because I tend to notice that people who are liberal Christians or people who are, but we'll set the Jewish brothers and sisters aside, because let me tell you, the liberal Jews are all in my emails too, because they're like, hey, we want to talk about Gaza. We're here. We'd like to be vocal. But when it comes to liberal Christians, people are not very assertive about wanting that narrative to be a part of their story. So if you have constituents who are in positions where they're going to be doing a lot of media, where they're going to be doing interviews, don't discourage or even encourage them to include their faith as part of that narrative. Because trust me when I tell you, many people in media don't know. They don't know that there are Christians of another sort. They don't even know they're there other than Bishop Barber. They just don't know. And since they themselves don't come from the church, they would never think to ask, other than John. They're not going to think to ask them about their faith narrative. They're not going to ask Barbara Lee if there was a faith imperative that led her to be against the war. They just assume that everything people do is political. And they assume that every act is political and not faith-based. So I would say encourage the people that are inside of your churches when they are talking about, why do I care about student loans being forgiven? Is there a faith component to that? It's a question, right? People should assert that I believe that I'm against usury because it's a part of my faith tradition. Right. So I think encourage people to include faith in their narrative when they are speaking publicly, just the way that Christian nationalists.
And use the language. I mean, when I hit Trump, I kept saying, y'all, that's cheap grace.
Can I just put
you got to use the language.
He'll use it, and he doesn't even know what he's saying.
Can I just put an exclamation mark on something Joy said, though? And I do this. I dare say that it is valuable to read the book of Matthew. And the reason it is valuable to read the book of Matthew is because you have that comparison, that discussion.
Book, by the way.
It's pretty good. Yeah. I'm doing Luke at the moment, but I understand.
I love Matthew.
But I'm going to tell you, you read the book of Matthew, right there's an awful lot there in the Sermon on the Mount about hypocrites.
Yeah.
Right? And you know, one of the things that's interesting about journalists is they do kind of like to call out hypocrites.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, then they need to go to Matthew 23.
Indeed. Well, here's our...
And the real hypocrite...
I was very cautious about bringing up Matthew with you leaning on my shoulder.
Matthew 20, because actually the biblical scholar Jonathan and I were talking about this the other day. Jesus was the one that coined the word hypocrite.
I know.
Nobody else
I learned
used
that
it
from
quite
you.
like Jews. But here's another thing I want to put on this. When in our movement, for instance, with the Poor People's Campaign and with the Moral Revival, one thing we say to local pastors is, in a movement, you have to go meet with your board of editors, your biggest editorial boards. You got to go talk to them and challenge them. On March the 2nd, when we did our big gathering, we got 100 million social media hits and earned media hits from the time we did our press conference at the National Press Club all the way to March the 2nd recently when we did. And you have to do actions. I hear exactly what she's saying. You have to do something that makes it newsworthy.
That's right.
You cannot just simply sit there, put your hand on the TV and pray that they're going to change the story.
You never
know. You got to do activism. And then you've got to realize that in faith work, we've always had to create our media. William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass, they had to create media, alternative sources, everybody back here had a media outlet. You know, we invest heavily in repairs and whatnot in a media team because you can't get in this game and not know that what they're saying. You've got to get in it, you got to push, you got to put, and then Tomorrow Monday, it took 6 weeks of consistency before the major newspapers picked us up. They were basically laughing us off. But we had to be consistent and stay there. And then at one point, we started controlling the media. We had a story every Thursday night, every Friday night, every Monday morning, every Monday night, and every Tuesday. And people started looking for it. And we took over cable news, and we took over local cable. But I will say to those of you who are here, one of those struggles is, even when it's newsworthy, it's hard.
Of course it is.
Because when we put, Roland, thousands of people on June 18th in the street in D.C. after the insurrection, and we weren't in the street tearing stuff up. I mean, thousands of people filled up the blocks and had poor and low wealth persons at the mic, and we were talking about 295,000+ people dying in this country a year from poverty. I think that's pretty newsworthy.
Oh, yeah.
We literally, except for you, had news agencies tell us it wasn't a story. If Roland had been there, Joy did something. We had C-SPAN said they were going to do it, and then all of a sudden that morning I got a call. The guy was almost in tears. I've been told we can't cover it.
So there were press riots. There were 3 levels of it. And there were media spots for all of the networks and all of them. The 3 risers, it basically was maybe a third full. And you can just look down and see who didn't show up because their names were all down. And so that's what,
with thousands of folk.
Well, that's because
2.7 million online. Tens of thousands.
Somebody's made a decision
that
we don't think that is news. And so then that continues. And so what I'm saying in terms of how the challenge then comes in, if you're talking about, I was just thinking about in Alabama when Governor Riley tried to change the tax code, and he literally used Jesus as the model, and those same white conservative evangelicals, hardcore so-called Jesus-loving people, it failed 65-35. So they say they believe in helping the poor, but except they actually don't. So what has to happen is, so think about this here. How many times have you seen Catholic Democrats attacked for taking communion?
Oh, quite often.
But you never see right-wing Republicans attacked for voting against the poor. So again, the framing has to be different. So if I'm pastors in this room, now granted, I don't like when they do that, but I would do it for the purpose of driving the story. I would say if a Republican in Congress voted against, if they voted for cutting of food, if they're voting against the poor, that pastor should not be extending them any prayer blessings. Now, some folks disagree with that. The whole point is I'm trying to purposely create tension. Because I'm trying to purposely show, oh, y'all love to challenge them, say don't give them communion, but over here, y'all want to celebrate and you just sat there and voted against the poor. I'm going to use the biblical principles against them. I'm going to say, you can't talk about Jesus feeding thousands if you want to deny food to folk in this country and 30,000 die from hunger every year. So again, that's understanding the battle that you're in. And you can't be nice about this. That doesn't work.
Can I add to that, this is all Dr. King did, right? The reason Dr. King was so, that he was so effective is that he was young, and so he understood television.
That's right.
And so what he was doing was marshaling the visual forces of television.
Yes. Yeah.
But there are people who are being successful at that. When 1,000 pastors joined together and wrote that letter to President Biden regarding Gaza, what the media responds to are two things: conflict and change. And just understand that those are the two principles that actually drive the media. Because again, the media doesn't have necessarily a lot of policy, a lot of understanding and depth in terms of policy. The individual reporters they're not necessarily experts on things like religion or economics or poverty or any of that. So they look for change and they look for conflict. Obama was exciting because that was change. The Gaza issue is interesting to them because it's conflict. They don't understand the religious underpinnings of this conflict. They just understand it is conflict. So when pastors got together and they were in conflict with the White House, that was interesting to them. Moral Monday was a conflict between the Poor People's Campaign and the state of North Carolina. It was interesting to them. So they will be drawn toward conflict. But what happens is, I think a lot of time on the non-right wing of the Christian world, there's not a lot of conflict being created, to Roland's point. If you're creating conflict, the media will be drawn to it.
Can I just give you one?
Important. You can do it if you can do it in 1 minute.
1 minute, easy. Oh, I'm doing under a minute.
All right.
This is all about the national media. Most of you live in a place. One of the biggest crises in America right now is the collapse of journalism. The reality, we're losing 2 newspapers a week. We have lost half of the working journalists that we had 20 years ago. National media will continue to exist. Roland will still be there, and so will Joy. But the bottom line for you, what? Sarah, you actually are on the side that will survive forever, right? Because you.
We'll see.
Yeah, we hope. But what I really want to emphasize to you is that this collapse of journalism is real. We have news deserts across this country, places where you can do all the right stuff, and there's still nobody there even.
You ain't gonna necessarily be here either, brother. Cable ain't exactly surviving.
Fingers crossed.
I'm just being honest.
Let me tell you one line of core advice, and it was referenced a little bit ago. You must create your own media. Right. The fact of the matter is, you've got to get good at it, and the way to get good at creating your own media in your local context, right, is to go to your young people and say, all that time you spend on the phone, when I keep telling you to put your phone down, don't put your phone down anymore. Start communicating about these things. Use these new platforms to put video up, to put messages up, to be on Twitter, to be on Facebook, to be all these places. Because the bottom line is, with this collapse of journalism, with this collapse of media, if you don't fill the void, the other side will.
Can I just real quick from a technical standpoint, and COVID was awful, but if there was a silver lining during COVID, it forced so many churches to have to completely upgrade technology.
That's right.
I did sessions with 1,000 plus AME pastors on this whole deal. And I need you to look at your existing assets. I think when we talk about media, people start thinking about, oh my God, it's so difficult, got this. The reality is, right now, probably nearly all of you have a media ecosystem right now.
That's right.
There's a lot of places that are doing, they're streaming content, they're streaming video, but you now have to be thinking about that beyond Sunday or Bible study. When we broadcast from New Birth Missionary Baptist Church, we were there covering a rally for Ossoff and Warnock, and we were broadcasting it. I had a drone going with all this other stuff, and Jamal Brown was like, okay, everything he got, I need y'all to get. And so his video team told me, they said, man, every time you do something, we get a phone call or email, because he's like, Roland doing that, so I know y'all can do it. So what has happened is, he has completely changed not just the ministry, but has changed how they use media. And so he just launched his podcast. He just launched in his audio and video. But he's utilizing the platform to talk about the issues and the existing infrastructure. And so when you go back, you should go back and say, what's our infrastructure? What do we have? What are we using? And is everything that we're doing inside of the church building, are you shooting anything outside? What are you covering outside? You have, to your point, you have young folks right now who are master editors.
That's right.
You should be recruiting them to your church media team, and they can be churning out different types of videos based upon things that you do in the community. And so don't just focus on what's happening in the building. You can be literally live streaming, driving content externally, and now it serves two purposes. People are seeing what you're doing, whether you're protesting at the school district or the city council. But the other thing is, when they are showing the things that you're doing, how helping the community, that actually also will end up driving your membership, because they're actually seeing the church at work.
All right, this is Rich.
One more thing about that, and to John's point as well. Another thing about social media today is it often does, what you want to do is get on legacy media, it often feeds into that. I mean,
it does.
I've
They pick it up.
increasingly used, YouTube, podcasts, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, all of it to find sources. And of course, you have to check those people out, make sure they're who they say they are. But if somebody's speaking to an issue, that's especially with legacy media increasingly understaffed, it's an easy way for us to find people. So.
You are in a room full of people who have spent 2 days talking about stories that we want to tell and ways we want to change the narrative, and each of you have been a gift because you have been resourcing this crowd, and I know they want to join me in thanking you. Please thank this panel. Friends, we have more to come. Take a short break and we'll be right back.
All right, you didn't ask us our presidential question.